Hello, Guten Tag, and Assalamu alaikum, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of IRIS, I welcome you all. Today, we have gathered here to discuss a very pertinent yet not much discussed topic, the resurgence of religion in international politics. As we see in post-Cold War era, religion has emerged as an important factor in international politics. For instance, in Afghanistan, it is most likely that we'll have a Taliban regime which will run its affairs on the basis of religion. In India, we have PM Modi, whose most decisions are based on RSS ideology, which is why scholars like Christopher Jeffrey are calling Indian democracy as an ethnic democracy, an illiberal democracy. In Myanmar, there is ethnic cleansing, and in various South Asian states, even some religious groups are powerful enough to influence the governments. So for discussing these different dimensions, we have an august gathering of distinguished speakers with us. So without further ado, I would introduce my first speaker. My first speaker is Dr. Christian WAGNER. Dr. WAGNER is Senior Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. He was head of the Research Division Asia at SWP prior to joining SWP in 2003. He was a senior fellow at the Institute for Development Research and the University of Bonn, and an assistant professor at the Institute of Political Science and Administrative Studies at Rostock University. Dr. WAGNER is also a member of the European Association for South Asian Studies. He was a member of the board of directors of the German Association for Asian Studies. He was a visiting fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, the Jawaharlal Nehru Institute for Advanced Studies, and at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi. And I can proudly say that he also knows a bit of Urdu. So with that introduction, over to you, Dr. WAGNER.
Thank you very much, Mariam. The first question is always, am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So good afternoon to Pakistan, good evening to Australia, and good morning to the United States. Yes. So let me first thank the Institute of Regional Studies for the kind invitation to this webinar, which deals with a very sensitive topic. And let me also, and I'm also happy to resume my interaction with the Institute of Regional Studies, which I had many years ago during previous visits to Pakistan. So the title of the webinar, Resurgence of Religion, raises the question in how far this will be, let's say, positive or not so positive development for South Asia, or when you put it shortly, is religion part of the problem, or will it be part of the solution for the challenges that Mariam Mastur has raised? Let me differentiate the answer in two parts. I will look first mostly on the national level in a comparative perspective, what we can gather from experience so far from South Asia. And secondly, I will also look at a little bit on the impact and the repercussions on foreign policy. So let's start with the national level. That religion is a very important part in the life of South Asian citizens is well known. We have recently seen a Pew survey on India, which has highlighted again the importance of religion. So let me structure it by making three different steps here. First, I look at religion as a concept. Second, religion as a marker of identity. And the third one would be, what's the interaction between religion and politics in the region? So let's look at religion as a concept. We tend to assume that religion is always a consistent, a coherent set of beliefs and practices. But in reality, as we all know, it's mostly not the case. So religion also has to adapt to change, also in order to stay relevant. So when you look at the major religions in South Asia, whether it's Buddhism, it's Hinduism, it's Islam, it's Sikhism or Christianity, you will notice that they all consist of very different regional, religious, social, sectarian, and other traditions. So unity in diversity is not only between the different religions, yes, but it's also part of the process within the respective religion. So there's always been a gap between what we think religion is and what people in the region, in different parts of the region and different societies make out of it. Second point is religion is often seen as a very important and it is an important marker of identity. But it's not, what is also obvious, it's not the only marker of identity. So religion is in a, let's say, constant conversation or competition with other forms of identity, whether that's ethnicity, it's language, it's region, it's the class, it's gender or other forms, whatever you may think of. And then when you look at the interaction, that's the third point, between religion and politics, I think it's clear that when you bring religion to the political arena, it has to struggle both with the internal diversity as well with the competition with other forms of expressions of identity. So it's not astonishing when you look at the process of nation building in South Asia, let's say in a comparative perspective, it's often oscillating between ethnicity and religion. Democratic as well as authoritarian rulers have always been tempted and have always used or instrumentalized religion and religious symbols to increase the legitimacy of their regimes. But when we look at the outcome, let's say, the outcome is not very positive, let's say it's ambivalent at best. You look at the, let's say, positive side. So religion, especially when it's linked to nationalist ideas, to claims of nationalism, has brought enormous political results. You think about the Bandaranaike family in Sri Lanka since the 1950s, and the Sri Lanka Freedom Party, as Mariam mentioned, Mr. Modi and the BJP in India, and in Pakistan, one can think about Prime Minister Bhutto in the early 1970s, when he also put religion much more in the center of national politics. On the negative side, of course, we can also see that political mobilization and the instrumentalization of religion proved to be very dangerous. First point is it opens a Pandora's box which can hardly be controlled for its long-term effects. When you think about Sri Lanka, you will see that when Buddhism was incorporated in the constitution in 72, in the constitution of 72, that this has also hardened the conflict with the Tamils and has also then made a political solution much more difficult, which then resulted in a very bitter civil war in the island. In Nepal, which was a Hindu kingdom for many centuries, the civil war after 96 was also linked to minority and caste groups in Hindu society. So it was not openly a religious conflict, no, but it has certainly links which were related, of course, to religion. A very different case in this respect is Pakistan. Here it was, religion was, let's say, the founding pillar of the nation, of the new nation in 1947, but the common religious bond was not able to bridge the differences, the ethnic, the linguistic differences between the eastern and the western part after independence. Moreover, one should also keep in mind that religion can also backfire on the political leadership. It has often been forgotten that in Sri Lanka, Prime Minister Bandaranaike was killed by a Buddhist monk in 1958. Indira Gandhi was assassinated in 1984 by her Sikh bodyguards after a bitter conflict between the center and Sikh militants. It's also interesting when you step aside from the political realm and you look at the ordinary people, you can make the observation that the ordinary people, let's say, seem to be much smarter than their elected leaders when they look at the relationship between religion and other forms of identity. Surveys like we have seen in India and the day-to-day experience show that people in this part of the world are regarded to be very religious, yes. But does religion translate into support for religious parties? Mostly this is not the case. So when you look at the voting behavior in Pakistan, in India, in Sri Lanka, in Bangladesh, it's interesting to see that specific religious parties are not very attractive for the average voter. Yes, they have a certain share, but it's certainly not in correlation to what we would expect given the importance of religion that we can see from other aspects of life. So the average voter seems to find a relatively good compromise between the different forms of identity, and this of course corresponds to the daily practices of religion in the region where diversity and different forms of syncretic practices are very much important. Let me come to the second part very shortly, which is religion in international politics. Well, if religion is hardly works or is a very difficult concept in national politics, will it work in international politics? Will it work in the foreign policies of the country as well? My argument would be probably not. There are also other aspects which come into play when you look at the foreign policy arena. When you look at the wars in South Asia so far, most of them have been fought over disputed territorial claims. Yes, but territorial claims in the long term are somehow negotiated. It may take time, it may take forever, but a political compromise is possible. You will always find a solution to draw a line on the map or to somehow find proper regulations for different claims or for competing claims. It seems that religion is in that sense a very different object, because as religion claims the primacy and also part of your identity, it's mostly not negotiated. So neither on the national level or the international level. We've seen also in different countries within different religions very bitter fights among sectarian groups, for instance, which shows you that this, of course, is also not a good indicator for the concept on the international level. So territorial claims or minority rights are negotiable, yes. Religious claims seem to be much less. Moreover, one should keep in mind that most South Asian countries are multi-religious countries. So when you take religion to the center of your foreign policy, you may also create more problems than benefits also at home. So let me come to the conclusion. Of course, as Maria mentioned, religious events resonate in South Asia, yes. But from my reading, I think religion seems to be more part of the problem rather than the solution. Then the question is, what's the solution? I think the solution is most probably the respect for human rights, which includes religious freedom, yes, and good governance. I think this will serve as a better basis for peaceful coexistence of the religious communities, both on the national and the regional level. So with this, let me conclude, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wagner. You're very right. Religion is not the only identity, and giving a political dimension to it can be very dangerous. And secondly, good governance is the only thing that can put a stop to all these issues. So with these thoughts, we will move to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Senator retired JAVED JABBAR. Mr. JABBAR has distinctions in diverse fields. He's a public intellectual who makes contributions to leading think tanks, research centers.
That's enough.
Public forums.
Quarter an introduction.
Sorry? Okay. Research centers, public forums. He has received numerous awards. He is a former senator and has served in 3 federal cabinets as Minister for Information and Broadcasting, Science and Technology, Petroleum and Natural Resources, and advisor to the Chief Executive of Pakistan on National Affairs. He has represented Pakistan at major UN conferences. He's a member since 1992. Of the longest running, quite non-media reported Pakistan-India track to diplomacy. track 2 dialogue known as Neem Rana Initiative. He was elected Global Vice President of IUCN for 8 years, which is largest environment organization comprising over 130 countries. Mr. Jabbar's 15th book, Pathways Elected Writings, won the UBL Literature Prize for the Best English Non-Fiction Book at the 9th Karachi Literature Festival. He frequently writes on a range of subjects. With this brief introduction, Mr. Jabbar, I would really like to know that why some religious groups, which are not religious, I would say they are pressure groups, I would prefer them to call, I prefer to call them, have gained power in Pakistan. And do we have any strategy of minimizing their influence in the society? So with that, over to you, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I hope the answers to your two provocative questions will be contained in some preliminary thoughts and basic thoughts that I had formulated. But fortunately, no religious group has ever attained direct political power, as Dr. Christian Wagner very correctly pointed out, nor is there any prospect. They may be influenced from the outside, but they are not elected, authorized parts of the political power process. May I say thank you very much, Mariam Mastoor and the Institute of Regional Studies for this invitation. It's a very important subject, and I'm privileged to be part of a panel that comprises three other persons, in fact, two other persons, and Dr. Christian Wagner has opened the process most admirably and very succinctly. I would dare to say that the concept paper that IRS has very helpfully provided is pertinent, but it is unduly Western in conceptualization and formulation. For example, you quote Madeleine Albright right at the beginning, and then President Barack Obama finds a space somewhere, without any disrespect to them. But there are thinkers on this subject outside Europe and North America. Can we just say that there are four major levels on which international relations are conducted? First, vital self-interests and power. Vital interests and power are the two twins that have shaped international relations throughout history, even before the Treaty of Westphalia, when kingdoms or principalities cooperated with each other. It was vital self-interest and the use of power, the application of power. The second is strategic alliances that can transcend distances and geography, because those strategic alliances serve shared purposes. The third is global alignments, such as, of course, the United Nations, where power is deliberately diffused. The General Assembly is made powerless because 5 veto powers can outvote 188 other countries. But nevertheless, there is a global alignment which, for the first time in human history, has constructed a whole complex of laws, rules, governance statutes that determine how international relations are conducted. And fourthly, of course, there are ceremonial international relations, ties of religion, ties of history, such as most evident in the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is the largest such body outside the United Nations. Religious issues, of course, do impinge upon the conduct of international relations, but most often they are the result of internal development and internal conflict. Religion per se, not at least in the case of Pakistan. I am very intrigued by Pakistan's history, which is looked upon in a very negative light. Unfortunately, the general perception about Pakistan is so distorted. But for a country that was created on the basis of Muslim majority areas achieving their own autonomy and independence, it has conducted international relations on a very pragmatic, entirely virtually non-religious basis. And I'll give 3 examples. The first is with China. China, in some ways, is the antithesis of a religion-based state. It is a single party communist state. Long before it became the phenomenal success it is today, it was a communist state. And Pakistan was probably the first state in the world to recognize communism. So religion plays no part whatsoever, except, of course, in a certain part of China, the Muslims are in a state of beleaguerment, then Pakistan is concerned. But we respect China's policies in terms of their internal sovereignty. Second, with the United States, our largest trading partner, we've also had very important strategic links with the United States, despite the difficulty. And religion plays no part in the fact that the US offers the largest market for Pakistani exports. And trade is a very important part of international relations, as we all know. And third, India, the least likely country with which we would have had positive relations of any kind until the illegal actions taken on the 5th of August 2019. The trade between India and Pakistan, though much less than what it can be, was heavily in favor of India. $1.4 to $1.6 billion worth of imports into Pakistan, and only about $400 to $500 million worth of export to India. So despite the fact that there was already a BJP government driven by religiosity, Pakistan did not change its international relations in the context of trade or normal travel. Now, today's conflicts, let's forget Pakistan, even though I can't forget Pakistan, it's my beloved country. But let's set aside Pakistan. Today's most violent and sustained international conflicts are places where religion does not play the determinant role. Sectarianism only to some extent. Syria is a very major example, where purely geopolitical, geostrategic interests are shaping a terrible conflict. Similarly, Yemen, even though there is the Houthi element and there's a sectarian dimension, but Yemen is not a new crisis. Yemen and Saudi Arabia's relations have been historically very difficult to reconcile. And even in Africa, with Ethiopia and the attempt by the Tigray province, I do not see religion being a predominant role involving the concerns of neighboring states. Now, it is also necessary to stress that religion certainly remains a basic constituent even in supposedly officially self-described secular states. And I like to look at the name of the ruling party of Germany. I wonder why it retains the name the Christian Democratic Party. I mean, after all, the word Christian is a word worthy of respect. And even though it may be an inherited name, it shows that there is a preference to retain a religion-based identity. When US President Joe Biden took his oath in January, as usual, he took it with his hand on the Bible. Now, the United States may go forth saying it's a secular country, but the fact is the Bible is the holy book worthy of all respect of Christianity, not of Islam, not of Hinduism, not of Buddhism. So it is a very specific religious reference given to the assumption of power. Populism also, populism wherever it has occurred, masks a very strong religious dimension, whether it is Hungary in Europe, or whether it is South America, whether it is elsewhere in other parts of the world. Populism sometimes harnesses religious sentiments against the newcomer, against the immigrant, against the outsider, against the other. And then fourthly, look at the terrible phenomenon of Islamophobia, which you find rampant in states that call themselves, rightly so perhaps, secular, rooted in ignorance about Islam, rooted in racism, and combining to form a terrible example of how even highly educated, highly advanced countries have not been able to understand or study other religions with the detail and the respect that they deserve. So let me conclude by saying that there is a need for a far more intensive and sustained campaign by states in general and by civil societies as well to alter how people perceive the role of religion. Simply because conflicts take place within countries does not mean that they mar always international relations. But there is a need for greater understanding. We in Pakistan, predominantly 97%, even though we are very pluralist and we accept the diversity of the 3% faiths, we need to do much more to inculcate values of pluralism, respect for non-Muslims than we have. We remain an integrated society, but there is so much work to be done. And similarly, I think generally in international relations, there is a need for more effective checks and balances, part of the UN system, but also part of the non-UN system, non-state system, which can help identify the creeping use of religion, firstly for internal political gain or sectarian gain, which can spill over with dangerous consequences into international relations. And leaders, by example, must set the tone. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Jabbar, for your insightful views and bringing the strategic dimension of relations in perspective also, and also for acknowledging undeniable role of religion, especially by citing example of President of US, Joe Biden. With that, we'll move towards our third speaker. My third speaker is Professor SAMINA YASMEEN. Dr. YASMEEN is a teacher and researcher in UWA School of Social Sciences and director and founder of the University Center for Muslim States and Societies. She focuses on understanding perceptions of and by Muslims and Islam around the world and seeks to make an impact on Australian and global politics. Born in Pakistan, Professor YASMEEN commenced her studies in international relations with a specialization on China and Pakistan relations. She developed an interest in Islam and Muslims, researching the end of the Cold War and growing threat of radicalization among Muslims. Professor YASMEEN now extends her research on Muslim identities to jihadi narratives to assess the impact of jihadi literature on children, the relationship between women in jihad, and the de-radicalization policies adopted by selected countries. A key goal for Professor YASMEEN's research is to make a positive contribution to reduce ambiguities, build mutual respect, and actively participate in making the world a safer place for all. So with this introduction, ma'am, I would like to ask you that since you have worked a lot on Muslim societies, what do you think that why this ideology of policing others has emerged in our societies, though there is clearly written in Quran that there is no compulsion in religion? So why do you think this concept has emerged? Thank you. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you very much, Mariam, and thank you very much to the Institute for Regional Studies. It really has been a pleasure knowing the people at the Institute for years and being asked to talk about this subject, which is really at the heart of what I have been working on for the last, I think, 30 years. So, Mariam, I'll come to your answer maybe differently, but I hope I can come to that answer, or if I don't, please do ask me a question. I guess where I'd want to start is that when we talk about religion and its resurgence in international relations, we should really reframe that. And it's not a resurgence of religion in international relations. I think it's acknowledgement of religion in international relations. Because the subject, as we came to study and understand in terms of world politics, was so much constructed around the Western notions of secularity or secularism that we assumed somehow that religion is in the private sphere and politics is something else. And so the two could sort of complementarily coexist, but never really cross over into each other's space. I would argue that if we look at the world, especially after the Second World War, it's very clear that religion was always there in foreign policy and also in the way different countries constructed their identity. But it wasn't given the airtime because of the Cold War predominance in the discourse. But after the end of the Cold War and with the number of events that happened, I think we've started recognizing that religion is important. And so the first thing is that I think it's not so much resurgence, but it's the recognition of religion being significant in world politics. Let me come to South Asia. I think as Professor Wagner had already said, South Asia in itself is a very good example that religion was at the heart of how the British subcontinent was divided between Muslims or majority Muslims in the form of Pakistan and majority Hindus, even though it assumed a secular identity as the new state of India. So religion has been at the heart of how at least Pakistan has looked at its identity and how it has modified or shaped its relationship with the region, but also at the global politics. And I think in lots of ways, I would agree with Mr. JAVED JABBAR that it's been separate as well, because religion doesn't always come into play when we deal with different states. But I think even when we have been doing that, the reality is that religion has always been lurking there in the background somewhere. But from the 1980s onwards, it's recounting history. So I want to go through it very quickly. The reality is that our government in Pakistan consciously used religion to mobilize a sense of Islamic identity, quote unquote, which was not necessarily separate from, but more of a modified form of identity for certain groups. And I think that created a sense in Pakistan that somehow centralization of a particular reading of Islam equates with Muslim identity. And that, therefore, if you assume a religious identity, it can only be along certain lines. What has that done to Pakistan? I think what it's done to Pakistan is that it's created narratives that are very restrictive. It's created understandings that are often restrictive. And it's created a sense of what Mr. Jabbar was also talking about, othering anyone who does not follow that written or unwritten script of what does it mean to be a good practicing Muslim in line with the so-called assumed Pakistani Muslim identity. The impact of that, I think, is obvious. We know a lot about sectarian violence within Pakistan, and I'd agree with Professor Wagner that it's not just simply religious identity, but other factors were dealt with by using religion as an explanation. They were resolved by using religion as a weapon by people within Pakistan. So I think in lots of ways, if we're looking at the resurgence or increase in the focus on Islam within Pakistan, we can't get away from the fact that in case of Pakistan, with state direct or indirect support for restrictive understandings of religious identity over a number of years, has created a situation where citizens, sometimes with the government support, but sometimes on their own, assume the right to determine how Pakistani society needs to function. This othering comes with a lot of violence when it takes place. I'm not suggesting that Pakistan is a permanently violent place, but I think this othering needs to be acknowledged. Now, when I'm talking about othering in the name of religion in Pakistan, I want to now focus on our neighbor. It's not just simply in Pakistan. In fact, if we look at the more recent history, but a process that started again in the 1990s, and some would obviously trace it even further back, but the reality is from 1990s onwards, we have seen a continuous erosion of India's secular identity. And in that process, even though its Muslim population is 14% of the total population, and therefore could qualify to be a very significant country with Muslim population, has created a process in which Hindutva or Hindu identity has dominated the thinking and the practices and even the way citizens are being treated. And I guess it's in that context that what I think of, or at least the way I view the situation, is that the process that Pakistan started has been followed, but at a much larger scale in India. Using Hindutva language, the current Indian government has created the notion of the other being mostly the Muslims, but also other communities as well. And in that process, it's done the same thing which has happened in Pakistan, but again, I'd say at a higher level by creating spaces in which lynch mob killing is easily acceptable, or at least happens, even if the state sometimes comes up with statements against that, where any act of change of your religious identity is treated as love jihad, or whenever spread of corona is seen as corona jihad. So I guess in that sense, what I would summarize what I've been trying to get at is that if we look at South Asia as the space in which religion has been emerging as a force of identity and how it's shaping the societies, while Pakistan was the original trendsetter, Indian secularism, by giving up its secularism to a large extent, has really started taking the process to a new height. And in that process, the number of people that are being affected is a lot larger than in case of Pakistan. But is that something that we need to be proud of or be happy about if we're looking at it from Pakistani side? And I would say no, because the reality is that we do need both the countries, and I'm not even talking about other countries. Both the countries need to really promote what Mr. Jabbar was saying, understanding and acceptance of pluralism in the society. Unless and until we do that within India and Pakistan and other South Asian states, we would be going against the reality of our communities. Now, that's where I want to leave, because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about that. But the other bit that I want to address is, Mariam, what you had sent us questions in your concept paper, that can we or do we have the possibility of coming up with some international understanding? And I'm really paraphrasing your question. International understanding about not hurting each other's religious sentiments and beliefs and significant personalities. I guess when I want to answer that question, I'll go back to Pakistan and say, not just simply Pakistan, but other countries, but let me focus on Pakistan. Muslim states have been, since the turn of the new millennium, been dealing with a situation where at a global level, as Islamophobia has increased, they have had to face sometimes unsupported assertions and sometimes ignored the criticism of Muslim sensibilities. And the most significant in this case is really the Danish cartoons, which really started getting at the very core of how Muslims feel about Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I guess what I want to point out is that in this international arena, there's been a debate about freedom of speech and also the rights of Muslims to have Prophet Muhammad and other religious personalities respected in the way they think should be respected. I think given the fact that historically people were open to criticizing other religions, we could at one level say, well, that's been happening, so we really don't need to change it anymore. But I think, let me view this whole thing from a different perspective. In international community, where the international human rights regime has gradually evolved and expanded in its scope, the concept of violence against humanity, concept of violence against women and the children, it's become quite acceptable. I think we are, as a human race, capable of identifying when violence occurs and suggesting ways to counter that. To say that violating the sacred space that Muslims hold, or the space in which they hold Prophet Muhammad, is really something we don't need to focus on. I think it's really engaging in or justifying a different kind of violence. So I guess what I'm really arguing for is that there needs to be an international understanding that the way Muslims feel about Prophet Muhammad comes from the sacred space that has been accorded to him in our belief system. And to demand that that sacred space not be violated is not to demand something extraordinary. In fact, it is something that human race as it evolves and human rights agenda as it evolves needs to take into account. But let me then go and finish with the other question. Does this mean that it's only the Muslim right to have their religious views respected? Or Muslims also have a responsibility to other religious communities, but also to people who have a different idea of religious identity? I think the respect for plural understandings and interpretations by Muslims in their own religion, but also in other religious communities is an essential condition. Unless and until Muslims get to that point to constantly demand that our views are more significant and the views of other communities aren't, really is not going to lead to any international instrument that prevents these things from happening. And so I guess where I'd finish is that, to me, the answer resides in educational institutions and the societies playing a very significant role in creating the space in which different religious communities and even those who don't believe in religion can come together, they can share their ideas, and they can be respected for the ideas that they present. Once we have done that, then how religion manifests itself at the regional, local, or global level, I think would become a lot easier, and coming up with some form of understanding or some agreement that goes against violence of sacred belief systems and sacred spaces would be accepted. Not violence accepted, but prevention of that violence would be accepted. So I think I'll leave it here, and I'm sure after Michael, who has been patiently waiting for his turn, we can have discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yasmeen, for an enlightening talk and also bringing in perspective the phenomena of othering, and also suggesting that both India and Pakistan should promote understanding and pluralism, and also mentioning that respect of sensitivities in all religions should be promoted. So with this, I'll move on to our fourth speaker, Mr. Michael KUGELMAN. Mr. KUGELMAN is the Asia Program Deputy Director and Senior Associate for South Asia at the Woodrow Wilson Center, where he is responsible for research, programming, and publications on the region. His main specialty is Pakistan, India, and Afghanistan, and US relations with each of them. Mr. KUGELMAN writes monthly columns for Foreign Policy South Asia Channel and monthly commentaries for War on Rocks. He also contributes regular pieces to the Wall Street Journal's think tank blog. He has published op-eds and commentaries in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Politico, CNN.com, Bloomberg View, The Diplomat, Al Jazeera, and many others. He has been interviewed by numerous major media outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Financial Times, etc. He has also produced a number of longer publications on South Asia. He has published policy briefs, journal articles, and book chapters on issues ranging from Pakistani youth and social media to India's energy security and strategy and transboundary water management in South Asia. So with this introduction, over to you, Mr. Michael, but I really would like you to comment on the biggest problem now we all are seeing is the probable Taliban regime in Afghanistan. So what do you think that what would be the terms of engagement of the US with Taliban when they assume power? So over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mariam, and thank you to IRS for inviting me to this discussion. It's an important one. The topic is indeed very sensitive, but it's also very timely. And also it's an honor to be on such a distinguished panel with the scholars that you've brought together here. So, indeed, the main theme of this session is on the resurgence of religion in the international politics of South Asia. And I would argue that the more interesting dimension of this question lies in the resurgence of religion in the domestic politics of the region. We've seen increasingly strong expressions of religion in the politics of South Asia in recent years. And I think clearly the most prominent example, as we've heard already today, is India, where the current ruling BJP has espoused a very muscular version of Hindu nationalism, far more muscular than was the case when the BJP ruled several decades ago. And so through policies like the new citizenship law, I guess it's not all that new anymore, but the citizenship law passed several years ago, through new policies in Kashmir, and through increasingly sharp communal language and rhetoric, the BJP has sought to elevate the status of Hinduism in state and society. But while the India case may be the most prominent in the story, there are plenty of others in the region as well. In Nepal, unhappiness with KP Sharma Ali, and who had been an increasingly embattled prime minister until he was removed from power just a few days ago by the Supreme Court, this has provided a fertile ground for some opposition politics, some of which has embraced Hindu nationalism, including specifically the RPP, a Hindu nationalist party in India. Nepal is a secular parliamentary republic, but until about a decade or so ago, it was identified as a Hindu state, a monarchy. And now we're seeing some opposition forces calling for the restoration of Nepal's Hindu status. And we should not overstate this sentiment. It's not supported on mass levels at all, but still it is there. I think it's important to acknowledge. And then there's Sri Lanka, which in recent months has come out with several policies that appear to be somewhat communal in nature, to put it mildly. For nearly a year, as I think we would all know, the government enforced a policy of forced cremations for all, mandatory cremations for all deaths, even though the country's Muslims and Christians are not permitted to have their dead cremated. The government claimed the policy was meant to avoid transmission of COVID-19 at burials, but health experts have unanimously, unequivocally said that burials do not pose a COVID risk. So that raises the question of why did Sri Lanka come out with that policy? The government in Colombo has also tabled a few laws of concern, one of which would shut down a large number of religious schools, Muslim schools. And also there has been a law that's been tabled that would ban burqas. Now, these have not been ratified, these policies, but they have been discussed. They have been a part of the political debates. I think that's important to highlight. And then there's Bangladesh, where Hafizat-e-Islam, a very, very large, what I would describe as a hardline Islamist party, has become increasingly vocal and active in recent years. And so earlier this year, when Narendra Modi was visiting Dhaka, the group staged very large, violent, and indeed deadly anti-Modi protests. Now, after those protests, the government in Bangladesh cracked down very hard on the Hafizat. Most of its leaders were arrested. So the party has been significantly weakened, but it has not gone away. It's still very much present. And then, of course, there's Pakistan, where we've seen the proliferation of a series of new hardline Islamist political parties in recent years, the main one being Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, TLP. And as we've discussed, as we've heard, religious political parties are nothing new in Pakistan. But what appears to be striking about TLP is that it has not only been able to mobilize in large numbers, which is nothing new for religious parties, but it's also been able to gain a fairly respectable share of votes in local elections over the last few cycles. Now, this is significant because Pakistani religious parties typically mobilize successfully in the streets, but not at the ballot box. So what do these manifestations of religious politics and domestic politics entail for the international politics of South Asia? I think that we can tease out a few striking examples. One is India. Several of its policies, inspired by Hindu nationalism, have impacted for the worse its relations with its neighbors. So, the CAA, the citizenship law, that sparked tensions with Bangladesh when it was first ratified. Its policies in Kashmir, which have included changes that make it easier for members of the Hindu majority to invest in and acquire land in Muslim majority Jammu and Kashmir. This has sparked tensions with Pakistan. Meanwhile, the TLP in Pakistan, it harbors grievances that have become international in nature. So the last major confrontation between the TLP and the state revolved around the TLP's demand that Islamabad expel the French ambassador because of cartoons in France depicting the Prophet Muhammad. But the most prominent example of the resurgence of religion in the politics of South Asia is in a country that we haven't mentioned yet, though Mariam hinted at it before in her prompt, Afghanistan. The Taliban, an organization that seeks to reestablish an Islamic emirate in Afghanistan, has, as we all know, gained a lot of strength in recent years. And as we speak, it's waging an unprecedented assault that's resulted in dozens of districts seized, surrenders of Afghan forces, captures of border checkpoints, including one with Pakistan, and so on. And I would argue that the Taliban's rising strength, the inability of the US to defeat it on the battlefield, and the US desire to leave Afghanistan, this prompted negotiations between the US and the Taliban several years ago, resulting in a troop withdrawal agreement last year that gave legitimacy to the Taliban. And this has led to the insurgents since then engaging with diplomats and officials from the region and beyond. And so in South Asia and beyond, governments have recognized that the Taliban is a potent force and will be powerful. It will remain powerful. It will get even more powerful no matter what happens after the US withdrawal, whether it's a peace process or a peace deal or not. And so this has prompted them to engage with the Taliban in order to help advance their interests in Afghanistan. Even India is now engaging with the Taliban. So essentially every significant regional player in this context has sought to initiate channels of communication with the Taliban. And there's been varying levels of success in that regard. Obviously, countries like Pakistan and Iran have had those relations for a much longer time. The interesting question is, what can we expect the terms of engagement to be between the US and the Taliban? And I would argue that the Taliban presents a unique case for the US when it comes to examples of political or other actors asserting religion in a political context in South Asia. The US either is not loved by these groups, but it doesn't need to deal with them. I'm thinking here of groups like TLP or Hafizat in Bangladesh, or the US gets along perfectly fine with these actors. And here I'm thinking of the ruling party in India, the BJP. With the Taliban, of course, it was the US's sworn enemy for many years, but then it became a negotiating partner. And now we've even heard calls from some in the US government for the Taliban to be a counterterrorism partner because both share a desire to target the ISIS terror group. But things are very complicated today. The US did negotiate that agreement with the Taliban in February 2020. Now it's withdrawing its forces from Afghanistan, but it continues to be involved in the broader process to get the Taliban to the negotiating table to hash out a political settlement with the Afghan state. The US, I would argue, has limited leverage over the Taliban. It lost much of its leverage when President Biden decided to pull all troops. The troops were the US's main tool of leverage vis-a-vis the Taliban, and now that's pretty much gone. So I think that we can expect in the coming months to see the US lean more on regional players, Pakistan certainly, but others too, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, the Central Asian states, as well as countries that don't get along with the US, like Russia and Iran and China. I think we can expect the US to lean more on these countries to build a consensus, to try to build a consensus and strategy for peace in Afghanistan so that the region can become more of a player in these efforts to facilitate a very fragile peace process in Afghanistan. And I think we're already starting to see this in recent weeks with conferences on Afghanistan sponsored by the Heart of Asia Istanbul process. And just this week, the SCO had a summit at which Afghanistan was a major agenda point. But getting back to the US, I think, has drawn a pretty clear line in the sand for its future engagement with the Taliban. It has essentially said that if the Taliban steps off the battlefield and negotiates a settlement that gives it a share of power, if the Taliban does that, the US will be willing to work with the Taliban and will continue to recognize it and view it as a legitimate player. It would be willing to provide financial support to a government with the Taliban. Yeah, remember that some months ago, late last year, the head of the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, a new U.S. government agency focused on supporting investments around the world, the head of the DFC actually met with senior Taliban leaders. But if the Taliban keeps fighting and if it doesn't commit to a peace process, if it seizes power by force, all bets would be off for the US. It would not engage with the Taliban. It would not provide aid. It would regard the Taliban as a global pariah, just like it did in the 1990s. And I would argue that the religious angle to this story is actually not all that significant from a US perspective. The US's main concern is how the Taliban achieves power and how it and not how it uses that power. So if the Taliban gain power through a negotiation and settlement, the US would likely engage with the Taliban, even if the Taliban uses its leverage and talks to negotiate a system that resembles an Islamic emirate. To be sure, the US would want an emirate system to allow for human rights and women's rights, which the Taliban has not been supportive of in the past, but the US would not necessarily refuse to engage with the Taliban just because the Taliban happens to oversee an emirate. If the Taliban reaches that point through negotiations, that may be enough for the US. But of course, we could have a situation where the US conditions aid to the Taliban in an emirate system on the Taliban, showing demonstrably that girls can go to school, that brutal and cruel forms of justice and punishment are not used, and so on. So my point, and to conclude, is that the US would have no inherent issues with the Taliban holding a lot of power in a post-war emirates that comes via negotiations. The concern for the US is whether such a system would be less draconian and autocratic, theocratic than it was in the 1990s. At the end of the day, the US is not going to have much leverage to move the needle on these issues. It will not have troops on the ground. So this means if there is an intra-Afghan dialogue, and that's a big if, especially one that succeeds, the direction and trajectory of that negotiation and the components and nature of a post-war political system that emerges from the negotiation would be completely in the hands, and it would be ultimately in the hands of the Afghan state and the Taliban. The US would simply be looking on from the outside. So where to go from here? Very briefly, I'll make a pitch for efforts to promote and produce more religious tolerance in the region. This is a clarion call that certainly can apply to the world on the whole. Religious intolerance is one of the great global problems of our times, and it plays out everywhere, including in the US. In the South Asia context, what I would argue for is for political leaders, but even more so, importantly, social influencers to take more vocal stands on the importance of religious tolerance. Community leaders, including religious leaders, educators and teachers, and people with large followings, such as TV personalities, athletes, celebrities, we need them to be leading from the front, making pitches for the importance of religious tolerance. It's important that people that are trusted and respected on mass levels be the main messengers for this important point. You know, political leaders oftentimes are not trusted. So this is why it's important for social influencers to be out there making these pushes for tolerance. So I'll conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Michael, for bringing a whole insights from the region, from the entire region, and for also bringing in perspective the inclusive and exclusive approach of dealing the issue of religious radicalization in countries like South Asian countries. And however, it will be very interesting to have Taliban as the partners of the US in counter-terrorism strategies. So with these thoughts, I would, before I open the question and answer session, I would request Dr. Vikas Shukla, who is here with us from Uttarakhand, India, to give a brief comment on the new India of Prime Minister Modi. As we all know that the new India is totally contrary to the vision of Gandhi. So what is your take on that? Over to you, Dr. Vikas.
Yeah. First of all, I would like to thank to all the faculty members and given the opportunity to speak on this very interesting topic, the resurgence of international religion in international politics. So it is a very clear that the religion was never ever entirely absent from the study of the international relations. But I would like to focus on the South Asian perspective, because the South Asia is a totally different from the West and the European states, because the South Asia has basically the huge diversity, and with these huge diversity we have the lots of the problem as the religion and other the ethnic conflict is there, and the other challenges of in South Asia. And specifically I want to tell you that we are in the stage of the nation building process, and this nation building process we have the lots of the challenges, just like that the state building process, just like the poverty, just like the economic development, the malnutrition in South Asia, and the illiteracy in the South Asia. So if we are the focusing on the religion, or we can say that the religious fundamentalism, whether we talk about the Hindu nationalism, whether we talk about the Islamic fundamentalism, whether we talk about the other any kind of the radicalism in the South Asia, then we won't be able to establish the democratic and the inclusive structure, and we won't be able to focus on our the genuine problems which is we are facing nowadays. Okay, so in that context, we cannot tolerate the religious fundamentalism. Whether we talk about the in Indian context, whether we can talk about in the context of the Pakistan, in the Nepal, in the Sri Lanka, and we can take the example. Okay, and if we want to establish the democratic structure, if we want to establish the inclusive structure, and if we want to create the pleasant atmosphere in the South Asia, then we will have to focus on the first of all the regional integration, and we will have to focus on that the democratic structure, and we will have to remove the democratic deficit from the South Asia and the communal conflicts from the South Asia. If we can remove all these kind of barriers from the South Asian region, then definitely we can say that we can establish the democratic structure in South Asia, and we can say that something more than due to these comes some kind of the unwanted features, just like we are talking about here the religion, we are talking about that the ethnic conflict, we are talking about the communal conflict in this region. Then basically they are creating some kind of the barriers in the establishment of the state nation. Okay, and that is where I always say that it is a state nation dilemma in South Asia. So here I would like to say one thing is there. If you want to take the example of India, okay.
Dr. Vikas, we cannot hear you.
Fundamentalism in everywhere. Okay, it is we find religious fundamentalism in West, in European state, and as well as in the South Asian region. But my focus on that, I always recognize this thing, and I always focus on this thing. Then if we want to establish a very inclusive South Asian region, then we will have to focus on this our genuine problems, just like that I mentioned that the poverty, malnutrition, illiteracy, and economic development. And it is not the issue of the India, and it is not the issue of the Pakistan, it is not issue of the Nepal. Okay, it is the basically collective responsibility. Okay, so with these words, I would like to conclude my argument. So we will have, if we want to establish the democratic structure and the pleasant atmosphere in South Asia, then we will have to remove the religious fundamentalism from the South Asian region. And for that, we'll have to follow the Machiavellian method as well. So thank you, Mariam Mastur, for giving me opportunity to speak over this. Is a very interesting topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Vikas. Now we will open a question and answer session. I can see a raise hand option by Mr. Imran Sardar. He's a research analyst over here. So over to you, Imran.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panelists, for sharing wonderful and thought-provoking insights with us. I have a couple of questions. The first one is rather a comment rather than a question. This is my personal observation that this time around, the resurgence of religion is not societal at all. People are more aware of their rights and grievances that are playing a role in bringing a sense of sensitivity, rather religion, particularly in the context of South Asia. This time around, this is political influential people are reawakening the thoughts of religion as a sensitive issue for the people. Look at India, how Modi has brought a change in the behavior of the people. If you go into the detail, you would know there is a difference between Hindutva and Hinduism. In Afghanistan, you can see Taliban seems sensitizing the religion, but on the ground reality is that they have less control over the thoughts of the people and less sympathies. If you take the data of the last 5 years, you will realize that there are more sit-ins and protests against the injustice, rather religiously motivated protests in South Asia. There were protests, I'm not denying it at all, but the trends for me in South Asia seems top-down rather than bottom-up. I would love to hear the response from the distinguished panelists. Secondly, in the Constitution of Pakistan, disrespecting the Holy Book Quran is punishable crime. I think we need to add other holy books in this provision in which all the Muslims have faith, like Bible. In doing so, don't you think this would help bringing the harmony and peaceful coexistence? Thank you.
So who would like to respond to this question?
Mariam, can I come in response to the last you made?
Yes.
I think it's a very good suggestion that we do need to introduce understanding or what Michael was saying, tolerance, but I think it's more acceptance of other religious views, other religious communities. But it shouldn't just simply be limited to religious books or holy books. We also need to encourage respect for the religious places of worship. You know, in Islamabad, there's been that case of the Hindu temple. And that's something that I think Pakistani community needs to deal with. But definitely, I mean, we have, interestingly, done a lot more than was done in the first 20, 30 years of Pakistan's existence. But I think it still needs to be done more, and definitely with a focus on respecting other religions. And I think in doing that, we need to be very clear that saying that Pakistan is a state for Muslims does not exclude non-Muslims from that whole space.
Okay. So I can see a raised hand from Mr. JAVED JABBAR. So over to you, sir. So we cannot hear you.
I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me now?
Yes. We can hear you.
I just want to say that Pakistan is, I'm sure it is not a deliberate intent based on malice, but Pakistan often emerges as the bad boy of South Asia, which has injected religion into South Asia as if before 1947 there was no religion in South Asia. Mr. Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, respectfully disagreed with Mahatma Gandhi because he said, you are introducing religion into politics. And that is why he parted company with Mahatma Gandhi. But such is the distorted view of history in our textbooks and our narrative that Pakistan is seen as the hotbed where religious obscurantism has been fostered. I must point out that this Labaike Pakistan Tehreek, its outrageous demands were not accepted. The French ambassador was not expelled. There is a ban on that movement even today. The federal cabinet met yesterday and reinforced that ban. So it is not as if the state is retreating in the face of these people, and TLP is vastly overestimated because it has inherited the vote bank of what used to be called the JUP of Maulana Shah Ahmad Noorani. They have expanded it, but their core support already existed in Pakistan. They've become much more militant. I want to point out that even though Hindus in Pakistan are less than 3% of the population, 1.5%, in the 2018 election, 3 Hindu candidates in my province of Sindh defeated 3 Muslim candidates, not just 3, but about 10 other Muslim candidates. On general seats, Hindus and minorities in Pakistan have 2 votes. They can vote for reserved seats and they can compete in the general election, open, non-restricted. And they managed to defeat 3 Muslim candidates. So that's the kind of attitude you find at the grassroots level, not the kind that is reported when a temple in Islamabad is temporarily objected to by some extremists. I work with a lot of Hindus throughout Pakistan. And let me say that while they have genuine grounds for complaint, the vast majority see themselves as citizens of Pakistan. And of course, they have complaints, and validly so, and we need to work on them. But just this representation of Pakistan as a predominantly Muslim country, which factually it is, reminds me of what Albert Camus memorably said about what democracy is. He said, democracy is not about the rights of the majority. It is about ensuring the rights of the minority. The minority. We need to remember that very, very prescient and insightful comment. And certainly Pakistan has a lot to do. I'll revert with other unwanted comments later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jabbar. I can see a raised hand from Dr. Christian. So over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Mariam. Let me pick up some points. I hope I got properly from the question from Imran. Thank you very much for the question. I think there were 2 aspects which are important. First, of course, we see this trend, which was also mentioned by my co-panelists, from nationalist leaders to include forms of religion in a kind of a top-down approach. So this is really a sad development. Michael has mentioned it for the Sri Lankan case. We've also seen it in other parts of South Asia as well. Secondly, what I think is also important to keep in mind, and I know this is extremely difficult in Pakistan, and be assured, I also spend time on the other side of the border, and I can give you some insight how difficult is there the debate on your country. I think it's important to keep in mind that Hindutva is not Hinduism. Hindutva is a rather loose concept. It has religious connotations, yes, but this is not the main point. For the simple reason, it's extremely difficult for Hindus to find a proper definition what is Hinduism as a proper form of religion. It's even more difficult probably than for most other religions in the subcontinent. So also it's there, yes, all the points that have been raised by Michael and others are there, but I think what should also be clear that let's say the religious part is probably not the strongest one, because as Hinduism is a very broad concept consisting of too many different traditions, I think it's necessary to keep in mind that these are 2 other things. And Hindutva, yes, it's a nationalist ideology we know from many other places, but it's not necessarily, it's not in the first place, I would argue, not necessarily a religious one. It has more to do with history, with culture, with language, yes. So it's necessary, I think, to keep this in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vikas. I have a question in the chat box from a colleague, Mr. Arish. He has a comment and a question. Religion has been invoked for centuries in human history to answer moral questions and to maintain order in a society. Invariably, however, it has taken on a momentum and direction of its own, irrespective of its humanitarian utility. Neuroscientist and philosopher Sam Harris has recently argued quite cogently that science can answer moral questions and needs to be used for the purpose. Given the wealth of the wisdom of the panel, I would like to have their views on that. So who would like to respond to it? Harish is away.
Definitely not me.
Anyone else? Any volunteer? Mr. Jabbar, we cannot hear you.
But yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yes. We can hear you.
I love stepping in where I shouldn't be and love putting my foot in my mouth, so I'll proceed. But could you summarize what is the core query that the questioner has? Pardon my requesting a repetition.
So the question primarily is that if science can answer the moral questions, then what's the utility of religions? That's primarily the contention of Sam Harris, who is a neuroscientist and a philosopher.
Yeah, well, the answer to that would be the human mind and the human psyche, the human being is a remarkable composite of very tangible constituent elements. This amount of blood, 2 ears, 2 eyes, measurable, tangible. You know that this is a human being. But what goes on inside the mind? What makes the heart beat faster? Not just because of cholesterol. This is an unexplained mystery, and that's the beauty of humanity. So one cannot compartmentalize religion and science as antithetical or being surgically separable from each other. Religion includes the study of science. Science should include the study of religion to try to better understand what makes the human being this marvelous set of contradictions that human nature represents. So there is no question of science alone per se ever being able to find all the answers that religion offers. There is something called spirituality that is beyond religion. It transcends religion. Spirituality is what binds humanity. So let us stay with religion as long as it is viewed, interpreted, and practiced without offending someone else's religion. As long as we use religion to liberate the mind and not to imprison it in outmoded, outdated interpretations of 1,000 years ago. There is a need for ijtihad. Ijtihad is the real jihad in Islam. We've abandoned that and adopted jihad, and everything is about jihad. Ijtihad is the application of new knowledge to be able to interpret and apply the basic principles of Islam. And ijtihad's pace needs to be far more vigorous. And that is where the answer to the question lies. I want to remember, I conclude my answer by remembering what the man who's called the poet-philosopher of Pakistan, Allama Iqbal, said in his great series of lectures called The Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. In 1919 in Madras, my hometown, my birthplace, he said, all that is secular is deeply sacred at the roots of its being. What does that mean? The word secular has been mistranslated in Pakistan into godlessness or atheism. Whereas secularism is about every faith, respect for the world, respect for the planet, respect for every other human being. So the answer to that is to see the points at which religion and science can fuse, synthesize, and where they need to be respected for what they are separately.
Thank you, Mr. Jabbar. Dr. Christian, would you like to respond to it?
Yes, I just also can add what Mr. Jabbar has mentioned. I think religion or religious reasoning is one form of reasoning, yes, but in societies you normally find other forms of reasoning, so it's always difficult or it's always a process to see a good compromise between the different traditions that you have in society, as you have these different kind of ethnic markers. Yes, religion is not the most dominant one. This is what you can see, and it's also not the most homogeneous one, as you can see, and we have heard it here from the different strands in the different religions. Another aspect where you can see that, let's say, where I would also support Mr. Jabbar's argument, science alone is not, can also not be the only source. You could easily see it in our recent COVID crisis, under which all our societies suffered enormously. We had a debate in Germany, and I'm sure you also had it in Pakistan. Scientists would have followed a different strategy compared to politicians. So it was clear from purely scientific perspective that that people or the state would have to act in a very different, probably much harsher way. But a politician always have to keep in mind, or have always to find a compromise between the different constraints that are there in societies. How much is there? How much of lockdown do you need? How much will it affect the economy? Will people die because of the virus? Will they die because they get unemployed and will not be able to support their families? So in that sense, I would say from a strictly scientific point of view, we would have seen a very different approach. And this, I think, why it's also a good sign to see that we have to keep in mind a very different approaches. Science certainly be a most important one, but also not the only one. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wagner. I can see another question from my colleague, Nabila Jaffer. Her question is that it's a comment and a question. Religious identity is more often used to create narratives against the adversary, such as after 9/11, the term Islamic terrorism and Muslim terrorists was relentlessly used, which was the generalized term. We can see radicalization and violence in other religions as well, and we believe that terrorism has no religion. So what is your take on that? Who would like to respond to it? I think Mr. Michael would like to respond to it. You were leaning towards unmuting your button.
Thanks. No, actually, my eyesight is going bad, so I was actually leaning closer to the chat box to read the question. But I'm happy to try to weigh in a bit. This has been a terrific, fascinating debate, and many of these questions are far above my pay grade to answer. But in terms of this most recent one, no, I think it's very clear. No religion condones violence and terrorism, and that's why I think it's become a cliche. But you know, any individual organization that carries out violence or any type of terror in the name of religion, it doesn't represent a religion. I think that's quite clear. And that would not only apply to those that carry out violence in the name or claiming to carry out violence in the name of Islam. It would apply to other religions as well. And I think that we must acknowledge, and this group would certainly agree, that you have extremists, you have religious extremists of all types. I mean, certainly the way in which the media dynamics work, particularly in the West, the emphasis will always be on Muslim extremists, so to speak, which is also a term I don't like. But at any rate, I think for me, the answer is very simple and perhaps very non-academic. It's sort of a reflexive response that no one that stages violence is doing that. No, that cannot represent religion. It doesn't, and it's a travesty when people try to claim that that's the case. Thank you.
Thank you. I can see Dr. Samina's hand raised. So over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm glad, Michael, you said what you said, because I think we have conflated religion with terrorism. And as Michael said, because most of us, I guess, started with 9/11, we've always assumed that somehow Muslims are more of terrorists than anyone else. But if I was to talk about the changes that have been taken, for example, in Australia, given the fact that we've got right-wing extremism also coming up, and one example was the sad example was the killing of 50 plus Muslims in New Zealand. There's been a change in the way terrorism is presented. It's not terrorism as Muslim terrorism or Islamic terrorists, but now the terminology is shifting to say religiously and ideologically motivated terrorism. So it very clearly identifies that terrorism doesn't have necessarily one religion or one ideology. It could be motivated by either of those or different variations of those. And since I'm online, if I can also answer the question that I think is on the chat. about why is it that Muslims, despite the fact that Quran says there's no compulsion in religion, tend to police others in Muslim societies. Well, first of all, I think this tendency is not unique to Muslims. Every society or every religious community has varying degrees of policing the lived experiences of members of that community. Even the cults have the same process going. But since it's about Muslim communities, I could just share some of my thoughts on that, and they're not really the whole list of it. I think, first of all, it really needs to go back to the fact that Muslim communities, in lots of ways, stopped the process of ijtihad long time ago. And even though some of it was continuing under the radar or in limited spaces, the tendency to accept what's given as the ultimate vision or meaning of religion tended to predominate. And with that has been the tendency to see which views have got more power behind them. So if it is power of the state, it carries weight, or if it is power of weapons, that also carries weight. So I think depending upon where Muslims find themselves, if they think that those who hold power with reference to Islamic knowledge, they are giving their ideas, then there's a tendency to accept that uncritically. So it's very much connected, in my view, with the distribution of power. And I think, Michael, just to talk about Taliban, I think as things change in Afghanistan, how Taliban reassert their presence in parts of the bordering areas would also determine whose ideas are being listened to. But there's another element, and that really my assessment comes from how we have seen emergence for a number of groups within Pakistan, but also outside, even in Australia, that have presented the so-called final version of Islam that everyone must follow. I think it comes from limited knowledge of the essential principles of religion. The religion that actually promotes the knowledge, promotes a concept of research, knowledge, and learning about different meanings. Because we haven't really brought up children in that critical thinking space for a number of years, and because in Western liberal societies where Muslims, like me, are a minority, the nodes of information have been limited. When Islamophobia started emerging, people have really looked at what is the easiest source of information, and the one who gives them that answer, they think that's a final answer, especially if it's got with it some form of power attached to that. That's why, what was it? Darul Huda, I'm probably
Al-Huda.
Al-Huda. That was, the classic example of how their ideas just really caught a lot of women in the elite class, because they had limited knowledge of Islam before that. And once they were exposed to this, they thought that's all Islam is all about. That's the same that we see even in minority spaces like in Australia, when after 9/11, some very restrictive interpretation of religion was promoted by groups in the name of the Islamic knowledge, and others just accepted that. But the more it became a discussed topic, the more division started appearing, and now there tends to be an acceptance that there isn't just one version of Islam. There could be different meanings or understandings of that. So it's a long answer to say that it's linked to notion of power, lack of knowledge, and the way we have actually learned not to go into research and opening our mind, which is the very basis of Islam.
Mr. Jabbar, would you like to respond to it?
Not to respond, but to first of all express my deep appreciation for the observations made by the three other panelists and by the questioner, some very perceptive questions. I just want to hurl 4 unwanted thoughts before you will mercifully see me off. Number 1, the Afghanistan crisis and the Taliban are seen as expressions of religious zealotry. And indeed, in some ways, their primitivism about women is reprehensible. But let us remember that the root of the Afghan crisis and the eruption of the Taliban is a reaction. It is a reaction to the violation of international law and national sovereignty, first by the Soviet troops that invaded the territory and occupied it, secondly, by the United States and by NATO. Religion has developed simultaneously, but it is a national issue. It is not just a religious issue, number 1. Number 2, even though Kashmir is a Muslim majority area, it is not on the basis of religion that the issue continues to fester. It is the denial of the right of self-determination, which is a secular right. It's not a Muslim right or a Hindu right. So when that right has not been given to the people of Kashmir, there has been a reaction for the past 72 years. And with this, yes, it is true that in 1971, religion could not keep East and West Pakistan together. But look at what happened afterwards. Bangladesh today is predominantly Muslim, is proudly Muslim, has no wish to merge itself into West Bengal or go back into India. It wants to remain a predominantly Muslim state with certainly very commendable secular credentials. And let us also remember in India, while it is very unfortunate how BJP is spreading the virus of hatred in RSS is, in the last election, in 2019, the BJP got only 38% of the popular vote. That means 62% of Indian voters rejected the message of religious extremism. So I see hope there. And my last 2 points are that the freedom of speech, even though human rights are universally recognized, freedom of speech cannot be unilaterally applied across the planet. You have to be flexible and allow for each society's interpretation of freedom of speech. We can never countenance, for example, in Pakistan or any Muslim country, the use of 4-letter words before the Prophet Jesus, who we respect. Whereas in the West, due to liberalism and enlightenment, so-called, there are examples in cinema, on the stage, where the prophet's name is used with a prefix of a 4-letter word. Now that will never be acceptable in certain large parts of the planet. And lastly, religious identity is a very useful, stable anchor of certainty in an era of unprecedented turbulence and volatile change. Artificial intelligence, super artificial intelligence, what have you. Religious identity allows you to hold on to some fundamental elements of identity. Those need to be enlightened. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Jabbar. Now we will have last question from Ms. Humaira Iqbal. Over to you, Humaira.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you so much, panelists, for your very interesting different perspectives on the subject. My question is that in the wake of this intentional globalized move, where we see an aggressive style of resurgence of religion to pursue the political interests of whatever the government is in power. So what is the future of democracy which ensures protection of different ethnic and cultural identities of minorities? Thank you.
So who would like to respond to it?
Any of the panelists.
Okay. Dr. Wagner, yes, you.
Thank you for the question, Humaira. I think democracy is probably the best institutional mechanism at the end to secure minority rights. When you look at your neighbor to the east, let's say, since the 1960s and 70s, we have seen an enormous institutional setting of different institutional mechanisms for linguistic groups, for ethnic groups, even for religious groups. I mean, Muslims have their own legislation in India. So in that sense, I think democracy is probably the most important and probably the best suited institutional mechanism somehow to secure the rights. And of course, it's also a very controversial debate when you have now developments going on which are going to curtail these kind of privileges that have been there for the religious minorities. So in that sense, I think democracy will still has its importance and its relevance and will be an important tool to secure rights of minorities, whether they're religious, ethnic, linguistic, or some other forms. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Michael, would you like to respond to it?
Yes, thanks. And actually, Dr. WAGNER just essentially responded in somewhat of a similar way that I would have to the question. So I'll just leave it at that. But I just wanted to quickly respond to something that my friend, Mr. JAVED JABBAR had mentioned earlier about the Taliban. And I agree with him that indeed we should not look at the Taliban strictly through a religious lens. And in fact, maybe we shouldn't really look at it a religious lens much at all. Indeed, because of how the Taliban appeared out of strictly political issues, Soviet occupation, US occupation, the Taliban was a reaction to that, indeed. And certainly there's some that describe the Taliban as a nationalist movement. And the Taliban itself has sometimes tried to project itself as a nationalist movement. I do not agree with that, particularly when it's depicted as a Pashtun nationalist movement, given that the Taliban has killed so many Pashtuns in Afghanistan. And also given that in recent years, it's brought in non-Pashtuns into its ranks. But I think the point here, the reason I wanted to talk about the Taliban, and probably the reason why I was prompted to talk about it in this context, is that its vision. It has a religious vision for what it wants Afghanistan to look like. It wants to restore this emirate that it had in place back in the 1990s. And I think that's, to me, it seems like an unavoidable fact. And that's something that we'll need to grapple with as we think about what the Taliban would look like and what its vision would look like if it's able to implement it, if it's able to hold power, because it clearly has a vision that is in many ways at odds with the current political setup in Afghanistan, even though the current political setup is very complex and very difficult and dysfunctional, to put it mildly. But I think that was my point, that the vision, the way in which the Taliban sees itself ruling and the type of political system it sees playing out in Afghanistan is one with a very strong religious dimension.
And Dr. YASMEEN, yes.
Thank you so much, Michael, for raising this, because I think I want to draw attention to what I see, and maybe staying away from Pakistan in COVID-19 era maybe sort of has affected my vision, but I just think it's going to be very serious development for Pakistan if Taliban manage to control, and if they reassert or reestablish an Islamic emirate. Even though it's an Afghan decision, I think it's going to have implications for Pakistan. And Mariam, your question about how people tend to deny others the space for their own religious views, or meaning attached to their religious identity, that could become slightly more difficult for Muslims in Pakistan who don't necessarily agree with the Taliban-esque kind of understanding of Islam. So I think in that context, while having Taliban who may be more willing to agree with Pakistan is good, our government also, Pakistani government, needs to be also careful to make sure that their ideas are not allowed to infiltrate into Pakistan to an extent that it ends up creating divergence or differences within Pakistan. I think it's a threat that has been there before, and we can't really discount that. So thanks for raising that, Michael.
Thank you, Dr. Yasmeen. Yes, I recently read a very bad news in Dawn, maybe it was today, that Taliban have resumed their old ways and they have banned the shaving, and also they have asked the women not to go in the bazaars without any male companion. So I don't know what is going to happen, and we really don't want that kind of thing to come into Pakistan. So with that, we have come to an end of this session. Dank, and thank you very much, respected panelists. With this discussion, we urge that religion should be used to enhance cooperation rather than inducing conflict, and the object should be to ensure mutual benefit. After all, we all are humans. And efforts at international level should be made to promote interfaith harmony. So with these thoughts, we will end over here. Thank you, honorable speakers. Thank you very much for your time, valuable time. And especially Mr. Michael for ensuring his presence at an early hour at the US. And my colleagues, our IT team, and the participants for their active participation. So thank you very much. Khada Hafiz. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for the great moderation, Mariam.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mariam, for organizing the event. Thank you.
The pleasure is all ours. Thank you.
Mariam, thanks Imran and everyone else.
Thank you very much.